Good morning. This is Dr. Mayorga, Mary Mayorga, and I have been invited by the search committee at Divine Mercy University to present and do a small video on a contemporary topic that impacts our counseling profession. And so, in doing that, or thinking about this, I decided that I was going to do a short video on artificial intelligence. Is it the new language of the professional counseling, and how is it impacting who we are and how we do counseling and its effect on our clients from an ethical and from a holistic perspective? So, we're going to examine this contemporary concern through the lenses of ethics, and I'm also going to discuss how the meta model of the person also intersects with the ethics of counseling. So let's go ahead and get started. I always like to write up a little agenda because I think it's important that whoever is watching the presentation as being a participant have an idea of how the points that we're going to be touching on. And it was difficult to write this agenda because there's a lot that I wanted to say. So I had to really pare it down. But there are two things that I really want to focus on in this presentation is ethics and the person that as counselors, our level of responsibility to the client and to view the client. My philosophy is to view the client from a holistic perspective. I'll share with you. I was teaching an ethics course, and we were talking about disciplines. And I was comparing the psychology, which is one discipline, to counseling, which is a different discipline. And the students were saying, well, what's the difference? And so we talked about psychology started out as a medical model. It's a diagnosis. Might have shifted a little bit, and I'm not a psychologist. I'm a counselor educator. I'm a counselor. And when you compare it to the discipline of counseling, well, on the very top tier of counseling is um, working with the client. We counsel with the client. All the other things, aspects of what we do as a counselor follow that, assessments and strategies, techniques, things like that. But we look at counseling from a holistic perspective. So when I work with a client or when I work with my uh, students, I say you look at the client from a holistic perspective. You look at the psychological, the emotional, the physical, the spiritual aspect, environmental aspect of the client. That makes the whole client. You've got to take every single part of that into account. They're not just a diagnosis. Right? They have thoughts, feelings, and ideas. And so that is something that is very important to me. And I think it's important to all counselors and to all counselor educators that when we're thinking of the client, we're looking at it from a bigger picture than just this little section over here that would be considered the medical model. And I'll give you another little story. My background before all of this was in nursing. I was a surgical nurse for 14 years with an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. And we did a lot of head and neck surgery. Right? A client or a patient would walk in and they were a nose, or they were a neck, or they were an ear. And so it tended to lose the human aspect of it if you allowed it to, especially once they were under anesthesia and they were in the operating room. The only thing you could see was the ear or the nose or the neck. And so that's how I would hear the physicians discuss the client. And if you allowed yourself, you could very easily lose focus that you were working with this human person who walked in scared, confused, frustrated, wanting answers, wondering what was going to happen to their lives if their diagnosis was catastrophic. And so those are all things that are very important to all of us. So again, in talking about this agenda, I wanted to make sure that I shared that with you. And so here's a little tidbit. I talked a little bit about some tidbits about artificial intelligence, and that it's been around for a long time. One of the things in my research that I found out was in the 60s, there was a computer that was being used in experiments with clients that thought they were talking to a therapist, only to find out it wasn't a therapist, it was a computer. So I think we can agree that artificial intelligence has been around for the space age, government, military, medical, and in the last, I don't know, maybe the last 10, 15, 20 years, it has seeped into our profession. And in the last couple of years, it's accelerated. Back in the 80s and 90s, the topic of distance counseling started up. And people talked about distance counseling. What does that mean? Well, it was okay, if your client's somewhere else, you're going to do a phone call or they can email you and then you can talk to them and handle it that way. But it was too gray. There wasn't enough guidelines. There was a lot of concerns from a legal and ethical perspective of who was going to take care of the client, who would be willing to pick up the client when they're somewhere else. You just couldn't, it wasn't, there was too much hassle. Uh, People weren't willing to do that. And ACA was kind of scratching his head, the American Counseling Association. Well, how do we do this? They eventually did develop something for distance counseling, but kind of fizzled out and it moved over to coaching. You began to see counselors do coaching that wasn't at that time wasn't regulated. You could do it on the phone, you could do it through email because you weren't counseling anyone. You were simply advising them about whatever they wanted to do. Then you fast forward, and then we were forced into really developing guidelines and ethical codes because COVID came along. And with COVID, you couldn't abandon your client. You couldn't just say, well, I'm not going to be able to see you now because we can't get together in the office. And so, how do we do this? And so, ACA got on board. Uh, we recognized we had to be trained. We had to understand what we were doing. We had to advise our clients. And so all of that fell into place. And then at the same time, the AI industry developed all sorts of platforms, Chat GPT, Simple Practice, telepsychiatry. I just inserted three of those, but I had a plethora. I had lists after list after list of things that are out there. I remember somebody saying, "Do you use Calm?" I was like, "What is that?" And they, "Oh, well, that's you download it on an app. There's tons of apps, and if you're anxious, you just, there's breathing exercises, there's music, there's this or that." And I thought, "Oh yeah, okay, I can see that. I can see somebody using that if they've had a bad day." But I'm not sure that I would want them to use that if they have severe depression and they're trying to take care of themselves that way and it's just not working. So, again, pros and cons about AI that we need to be aware of as counselors. And then we're going to, of course, discuss our roles and our responsibilities, the application of ethics. One of the There's a simple little statement that I learned, and I know we all have learned that we learn in counseling when we first start a program, where it says "do no harm." I remember having a my first course that I took. In walks my professor and says, "Listen," he said, "if you don't learn anything in this class, okay. But the one thing you do have to leave here knowing is this statement: do no harm. And if you have to print it on your forehead, you're going to print it on your forehead." And I remember thinking, wow, that's intense. Do no harm. Well, let me find out exactly what this means. And as I got further along, I recognized the level of responsibility that we have as counselors to do no harm. And so, again, looking at the person from a holistic perspective, and recognizing that any one of those areas we could do harm in if we're not um, recognizing the impact of what's going on in our client's life. And then, of course, the meta model of the person and how it discusses the theological, the philosophical, and the psychological aspect of the client, which I find that it intersects to some degree with ethics. And so we're going to look at that also. Here's a little snippet of what's occurring. I looked at a chart, at a graph, and realized that by the year 2027, $3.8 billion will be utilized in developing AI, and it's just keeps going higher. And we recognize, I don't know if it's going to be here for the rest of our lives, but it certainly is going to be a big part of society. Um, we already discussed the impact that being on your phone all the time, looking at all the apps, looking at all these different platforms, all these games, it, it's impacting us. And so, if we're going to have AI in the field, then we need to make sure that we have some kind of guidelines and that we are part of that. And I'm going to talk about that as we go further along. But I have some pictures here. Chat GPT. I've already, you might have heard of it, I'm sure. As counselor educators, we try to stay on top of as much as we can. Uh, it, there's a company being sued by a family because they had a young person that was talking to Chat GPT, was suicidal, and we gave him some very bad feedback, and it didn't turn out to be a good thing. And so now there's that aspect. And now we see a robot sitting in front of a person, and we're not seeing it in outwardly in our profession, but it is occurring out there in the field in an experimental way. So we're not getting away from it. So therefore, we need to be able to determine how should it impact our field, how can we educate our students, and utilizing, if they're going to utilize artificial intelligence, in a wise manner, so that it uplifts our profession rather than add to the stigma of our profession. Because I think we can all agree that the stigma is there, and we have a difficult time sometimes encouraging people or letting people know that counseling does work when it's done appropriately, and already, erasing or eradicating some of that stigma. But AI could create more of a stigma in our profession if it's not utilized correctly. So let's see what ACA has to say about artificial intelligence. And there's actually a document, and it's in the references about this document that they created about artificial intelligence, which is where I went to do my research and find out exactly what do they say. Well, number one, they agree that it cannot replace human counselors. It can be supportive. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think that that's something that we all recognize and we're going to talk about. Where's the empathy? Where's the human nature? It certainly can be a support tool for the delivery of mental health services. We have people that live in rural areas. They may not have access to face-to-face services, counseling services. So um, the only way to do it is through the internet. So you might do telehealth, uh, and they can't travel to a facility. You have senior citizens that are in need of counseling services. They don't drive anymore. They're, to be able to get around, they can't do that. So it certainly would be beneficial for them. It cannot be a substitute for a human counselor, i.e., ChatGPT. It doesn't. You can't infuse human nature into. At least I don't think so right now. My own personal perspective into artificial intelligence. But I'm sure that they're trying very hard to say that they can. But at this point, the American Counseling Association and we as counselor educators can recognize that the human connection, the warmth of a human to another human, is very difficult to produce in artificial intelligence. Okay. One of the things that I found very interesting is the fact that they talk about the oversight from the counseling profession as they're developing these new platforms or tools to be utilized in counseling. We need to be part of the process. We need to be able to give input into what is needed for working with clients and is this appropriate or not appropriate. And I think that the article or the document discusses that they're wanting to do that or they're trying to do that. Another thing is the lack of empathy, sympathy, or human nature of AI. And I think that's a rhetoric that's just going to keep going over and over and over again. There's no way that you can offer a client what they're needing when the artificial intelligence can only regurgitate algorithms about what they're talking, whatever the topic is. Okay, and so a lot of another one is the negative responses. Biases, overly ambitious or overly simplified responses to the client's issues. And there's enough examples out there. I didn't want to put a lot of examples on here, but there's enough examples on out there that will tell you what's going on, that there is a problem there. Uh, Understanding the limitations and conferring with your client about the use of AI without supervision. Transparency is important. I want to know what my clients are doing out there, and if they're using it, how to use it appropriately, and can it be a substitute for or happening in the session, or can it enhance what's happening in the session? Okay. So again, development of an oversight committee of counselor educators as AI continues to be developed. That's very important. Principles of ethics in using AI. We are given a specific duty, responsibility when engaging with clients. We can't get away from that. Okay. So we've got all these principles. Respect the client's rights for their own decision. I'm just going to reiterate this. I'm sure that you're aware of them. Promoting the well-being of clients, acting in their best interest, avoiding harm to clients, preventing conflict of interest. How do we maintain trust, honesty, commitment? Fair and equitable treatment to all clients, being truthful and transparent in professional interactions, and upholding personal integrity and professional responsibility. Okay, so I looked at all of this and then I read the chapter in the meta model, and I said to myself, now how do the above principles interact with the Catholic Christian meta model of the person? So let's take a look. Now we know that these principles are very, very important. How do they intersect with the theology, philosophy, and psychology? And how do we present this to our students? All right, I broke it down, and from the I'm going to kind of give you a short little thought pattern of mine. It it made me think about the holistic perspective, where you look at all these aspects of the client, that they have a connection with Christ, that we have a responsibility to recognize and promote and embrace that the human is an individual, the human person is an individual. They have free will, they have intellectual, they have knowledge, they have a body, soul, nature. And also, all three of these aspects come together and basically are saying we cannot forget that the human person is all of these things, and that we have to be very careful, and that we're dealing with the fragility of a human person who walks in in distress, When the client comes to see us, I've got to look at the whole person. And the meta model of the person is looking at that. That goes along with the principles of ethics also. We're looking at the client from all of this. The meta model goes a little deeper. This is a human person created in the image of God, who is able to think, who's able to feel, who's able to be. And it is our responsibility to make sure that we take all of that into account. And this is what we infuse into our coursework when we are educating our student to enter and become counselors. You cannot disregard this. This is an aspect of um, who we are and how we engage with our client. They bring everything to us, all of this, and we have to make sure that we take that into account and to meet the client right where they're at. One of the hardest things that I have found for students to sometimes embrace is total presence. Uh, how can you can know strategies, theories, you can know all of this. You can't be present, then it doesn't make the impact. And when we look at the principles of ethics and we look at the meta model, this is all we're being told. This is what you need to be able to, us as counselor educators, to embrace, to respect, to recognize, and then impart that to our students as they decide to go out into the professional counseling world. So here's the intersection, and I'm going to wrap this up very quickly because I can see I'm down to about 8 minutes left. Uh, we will encounter topics that will be making an impact on the profession, either from a negative or positive. That's going to happen. But as educators and as counselors, we're going to be tasked with the responsibility of avoiding harm to our clients, ensuring that we recognize um, their humanity, their love, their individuality, and their unified nature. This is both from I compared ethics, this from non-maleficence and also from theology of the model. As counselors and counselor educators, we will continue to recognize and embrace our clients' intelligence, ability to express themselves, language, emotions, the mind, the body, the soul, and I took that from the autonomy of ethics and the philosophy and psychology of the meta model. And we will maintain our ethical standards because we have to honor that principle of do no harm. Always remembering that the body soul of a human person is a precious entity. So conclusion to this little video is remember who you are, who we are as counselors and counselor educators, and remember who the client is. AI is a tool. It's been around for a long time, but it's up to us to safeguard the use of AI with clients, to protect, respect, remember, and embrace the humanity of our client body and mind and soul, and do no harm. So I hope that I was able to impart a little snippet of my thoughts about ethics and the meta model and how it all belongs to us as counselor educators and counselors to remember, to be reminded, to remind ourselves that the most important person is the client as a human person who comes in agony or confused or frustrated. And all of those aspects are part of who they are. And we can't dismiss any of that. When we're going to work with the client, we're going to look at all of that and how it impacts or is impacting their lives, and how can we help them on their journey to mental wellness by looking and taking into account all of this that they present to us. And so thank you very much for allowing me to do this little presentation, and may you have a good day.